this video, we're going to be going over taking a percentage of a quantity. This is a great skill to learn because it is very handy in everyday life. For example, if you're at a restaurant, you will want to be able to calculate 15% of your bill so that you can give a tip. Or if you're shopping and there's a sale, for example, 20% off all jeans, you might want to be able to calculate in your head 20% of the cost of the jeans so you know how much the jeans will cost. So because this is a really important skill that you will use in everyday life, it's good to learn some mental techniques for doing this in your head. So that's what we'll be going over. Now, there are some percentages that are very easy to find. For example, 1%, 10%, and 50% are easy to just calculate in your head. So we're going to start with those. First, 10%. Here's an example, 10% of 80. And to go over this, I want to look at a bar model of this. So here's our 80. 100% is the whole thing. 10% is 1/10 of that. So this is 10%, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100%. So 10% is 1/10 of it. 1/10 of 80, that's like taking 80 divided by 10, which would be 8. So 10% of 80 is just 8. Now the way you can kind of write this down to organize your thoughts about this, you could say 100% is 80, so 10% would be 80 divided by 10, or 8. So to find 10% of any number, you just divide it by 10, and you can find that 10%. Now, 50% of a number is maybe even easier because it's just half. So 50% of 60, that would just be 30. So here the technique is think half. So that would be 30 in this case. And then 1% of a number, the technique is very similar to what we use up here for 10%. But here, we think 100% is 300 here. We're trying to find 1% of 300. 100% is 300. So 1%, there are 100 1% in 100%. So we would want to divide this by 100 to get what 1% would be. So 300 divided by 100 would be 3. So 1% of 300 would be 3. So to get 1% of a number, you just divide that number by 100 to get what the 1% would be. Okay, so now what we can do is expand upon these three, the basic 10, 50, and 1%, to find other percents. For example, what if we wanted to find 20% of 80? So here if we found 10% of 80. What if we wanted to find 20%? So again, 100% is 80. 10% is 80 divided by 10, which would be 8. So then 20%, we just adjust this. If 10% is 8, 20% is double that. It's 16. Likewise, you could say, what is 70% of 80? Well, 70%, you just take the 10% times 7. So 10% is 8. 8 times 7 is 56. Okay, so that's how you adjust the 10% to find any other multiple of 10%. 20%, 40%. All of those can be found using this technique. Now, we can adjust this 50% to find 25%. What if we wanted to find 25% of 60? So here, a good technique is to start with 50%. So 50% is 30. Half of 60 is 30. And then to find 25%, that's just half of the 50%. So that would be 15. So 25% is like taking half of a half. So there's that technique. Now you can expand on the 1% to find things like 3%. So 3% of 300. Let's try that. So again, we start with, well, 100% of 300 is 300. So then 1%, we go down to the 1%, is 3. You divide it by 100. So then 3% would be 3 of the 1%, or 9. So 3% of 300 would be 9. So this is the basic technique for all of these problems. If you can take the 1, 10, or 50%, if that's all you need to do, use one of these techniques. And then if it's a multiple of one of these, just adjust these techniques as I did here to find your percentage. Now another percentage that's very popular that you want to find is 15%, as I talked about with finding a tip, like at a restaurant. So 15, let's go over an example of 15%. So 15% of 80. So again, we can start with the 10% of 80. So 10% of 80 is 8. Right, 100% is 80, so 10% is 80 divided by 10, or 8. Now, what we want to think about is, 15% is actually 10% plus 5%. So if the 10% is 8, so 10% is 8, 5% is going to be half of that, 4. So it's going to be 8 plus 4, which is 12. So 15% of 80 is 12. Let's do another one with the 15%. 15% of 140. So again, we'll start with 100% is 140, so 10% would be 140 divided by 10, or 14. So now we want to find 15%, which would be 10% plus 5%. So the 10% is 14. 5% is going to be half of the 10%. So 7. Add those together, and you get 21. So if you went to a restaurant and your bill was $140, you're going to want to give a tip of about $21, since 15% of 140 is $21. So this is something I want you to work on doing in your head. If you saw this on the Sprint, you would say, oh, 10% is 14, so 5% is 7, 14 plus 7 is 21. That's how I want you to think about those. Let me just do a few more here. So let's say now 100% of a number is super easy to find. Example, 100% of 159. That's just all of it. 100% just means all of it. So 159. So you might see something like that. But you can go over 100%. You could have 120% of something. So let's say 120% of 200. So you want to think about this as 100% plus the 20%. So 100% plus the 20%. 100% of 200 is just 200. But then you need 20% of it. So now, think about going back to the 10%. 10% of 200 would be 200 divided by 10, or 20. So 20% would be double the 10%, so 40. So see how I did that in my head. Now you can add them, and you get 240. Let's do one more. 150% of 200. Now this is even easier because 150% is 100% plus 50%. So 100% of the number is just the number itself, and then 50% of the number is half of it. So half of 200 is 100. You add them and you get 300. So 150% of 200 is 300. Just think in your head. What's 50% of 200? That's 100. So 150% of 200 would be the 200 plus the 100, or 300. So hopefully that should give you all you need to be successful with the sprint. Just make sure you understand the techniques for finding 1%, 10%, and 50% of a number, and then know how to adjust those to find other percents, such as 15% or 20% or 120%. So good luck.